LaPetit Résistance, a philosophical fiction, by R. William Chapman. LaPetitRésistance.com. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterward. These are games one must first answer. Albert Camus. If one compliment could be given to the culture of the authoritarian regime, it would be the establishment of unity under a facade of divine purpose. But Paris was not like the concrete gridded corridors of Berlin. For all its beauty, this patchwork blanket crumpled beneath the onslaught of swastikas and its administrative perfection. True freedom is not accustomed to this particular kind of order. At first, the Germans moved like polite houseguests, perfunctory respect for the city's grandeur and history. Indeed, it is an orderly choice. It seemed only an excuse for their later brutality. The soldiers sipped wine at the cafes, and the walls were still dripping with the dew of Marxist ideology. They pretended to tolerate the haphazard placement of sculptures, paintings, and books in her shops. They admired orderly paintings in galleries where not for their beauty, but for their presentation. Discoloured squares were the only remnants of the occasional Jewish painting. Where the cafes had once hummed with heated debates and laughter, there was now only orderly silence, punctuated by the clatter of jackboots on cobblestones. Wobbly tables where poets scribbled verses and artists sketched now hosted gloved German hands sipping coffee. Montmartre's painters shuddered as sunlight danced off the Seine, and the fabric of market stalls faded into monotony. The posters and graffiti of dissent were torn down or painted over with the tulpa of order, the stark black and red of the swastika. Every corner of the city seemed smothered in order and compliance progress to some. Its vibrancy is leached by fear. Even the voices had changed. Street vendors no longer shouted their wares with gusto, and musicians no longer filled the air with spontaneous melodies. Instead, whispers and murmurs echoed in the stillness, the sounds of a city holding its breath until it had permission to breathe. Fascism demanded uniformity, and Paris, in all its chaotic brilliance, was a contradiction to that demand. The remnants of the city were categorized, organized, and labeled into submission. Authoritarianism finds its brutality in the orderly application of seemingly valid means. Indifference replaced laughter, and love drained, which set the stage for cruelty. But the Germans alone could not have orchestrated the city's transformation. The hand of German power must be blended in the meritage of a velvet glove and punctuated by perfect French. Abrupt change gives rebellion purpose. The slow drain of bureaucracy makes inaction a virtue with an uncertain reward. The prefecture. It began subtly, with whispers of laws and decrees. Fantôme and the residents of the tightly packed rue had watched Lionel Abramovici return from the prefecture on September 27, 1940. The painter's face, usually warm and expressive, shuffled his new registration papers in disbelief, turning into his oak doorway. Before taking off his hat and entering, he turned and looked over his right shoulder straight through Fantôme. Fantôme's fingers pulled back the lace curtain. He thought of retreating, but it was too late to hide his shame. Lionel nodded, respectful even in his dissent. He mourned with Fantôme. Excuses rattled through Fantôme's mind. He had no bullets for the administrative chains tightening around the Abramoviches. Wiping away his cognitive dissonance, he couldn't help but sympathize with some of the Vichy logic. Is registration of outsiders harmful? Then in October, the Vichy government passed its anti-Jewish laws. These weren't whispered decrees from a foreign conqueror. They were shouted proclamations from French lips. Jews were barred from teaching, practicing law, publishing or holding public office. They were stripped of their professions, dignity, and right to contribute to the city they called home. Lionel's paintbrush was replaced with a tool belt as he laboured for the shop owners and cafe owners who applauded his beautiful impressionist work. Shortly after, Fantôme overheard the Vichy's sneering remarks in the cafes. the way they joked about cleaning up the streets and putting the Jews in their place. They think only of themselves, one Vichy officer had said at a cafe, his voice low but sharp enough to carry. When the Germans arrived, they packed their bags with francs and jewels while the rest of us starved. They've always been loyal to money, not France. Phantom didn't believe the words outright, but he couldn't entirely dismiss them either. The stereotype of the wealthy Jewish merchant or the aloof intellectual had burrowed deep into the French consciousness, revived and magnified in the desperate days after the surrender. Phantom could not help but feel the creeping logic of the Vichy narrative, the way it wrapped itself in the guise of order, patriotism, and necessity. The French were always proud people, and as the water rose and air in the captive tank became a luxury, resentment, jealousy, and the need for a scapegoat consumed many. The pressure cooker of occupation and the microscope of Vichy intolerance created an insurmountable hurdle for any Jew or foreigner showing their worth. By May 1941, the mask of civility had slipped entirely. The Vichy orchestrated the Green Ticket Roundup, summoning foreign Jews to police stations under the pretense of paperwork updates. Phantom had watched from a distance as long lines formed outside the prefectures. The people stood with their papers in hand, their faces calm but their bodies stiff with tension. By nightfall, over 6,000 had been arrested and sent to camps. It was easy to pretend that these foreigners were being relocated, but Phantom was not accustomed to such willful ignorance, which didn't suit him. Walking through Montmartre, Phantom saw the changes the Vichy decrees had wrought. Shops once owned by Jewish families now stood empty, their windows painted with crude stars of David, or the word Juif scrawled in whitewash. Flyers and posters proclaimed the Jew as the enemy of the worker, the corrupter of French tradition, and the poison in the veins of the nation. It was absurd, of course. Phantom had known Ionel Abramovici long enough to see the truth. Ionel was no threat to France. He was a painter, a dreamer, a man more concerned with capturing the light on the Seine than with politics or power. And yet, Phantom could not shake the feeling of futility. How many times had he heard the neighbours mutter about the Abramovicis? They don't belong here, they're not like us. It was a refrain as old as time, given new life by occupation and fear. Phantom hated himself for wondering, even briefly, if the neighbours were right. Perhaps they should have left, he murmured one night, staring at the empty street below. Perhaps they would have been safer somewhere else. The thought disgusted him as soon as it formed, but it lingered. The Abramovicis hadn't fled or hidden, and now they bore the yellow star on their coats like a badge of shame. To Phantom, it felt like a slow march to their doom. But what could he do? He was one man in a city drowning in silence. The Vichy propaganda painted Jews as outsiders, manipulators, and people who undermined the solidarity France needed to survive. It was a grotesque lie, but a seductive one. Even in the resistance, whispers of distrust filtered through the ranks. Some believed the communists were too close to the Jews and that their ideologies blended in ways that could not be trusted. Phantom despised the petty rivalries within the resistance, but he could see how they festered. Fear had a way of making enemies out of everyone. Yet when he thought of Sophia, clutching David to her chest as the police banged on their door, or Miriam, her voice breaking as she tried to reason with the unreasoning, Phantom knew the truth. The Abramovicis were never the problem. They were the victims. The real enemy was the lie that Jews were to blame for France's fall, the lie that collaboration would save them, the lie that conformity was the same as survival. But even knowing this, Phantom couldn't help the poison that had seeped into his thoughts. The same poison had infected France, turning it into a pale shadow of itself, a grey wash over a once vivid canvas. The Germans might have picked the palette, but the Vichy brush stroked the canvas, turning neighbour against neighbour, friend against friend. Phantom hated them for it, but he also hated himself for being unable to stop it. There were a dozen moments of inaction, of silence for every act of defiance. And in those moments, he wondered if the Vichy were right, if the Jews truly did not belong. It was a thought he carried like a stone, heavy and unwelcome but impossible to put down. Grofats. Fantôme leered at the now empty Abramovich maison, lifeless and still. Ionel would not emerge with cracked oil paintings, no duvet hung from the window on a bright spring day. Even the songbirds avoided the stench of death and the stain on the cobblestone street. Fantôme's mind wandered as it did from time to time, to the day his hilltop was flooded with red. Vichy scurried to raise the imposing red flags on every lamppost in Montmartre in anticipation. With military precision, ton trucks idled puffs of diesel as German crews erected dragon's teeth, and barricades blocked each intersection near the hill. Her radio crackled night and day as the Montmartre quickly became encased in temporary security. Fantôme crouched closer to her, and she carefully turned the dial until the static gave way to a French, hurried yet composed voice. Grofats visitera Sacré-Cœur demain. Répétez, Grofats sera présent à Montmartre à l'aube. His heart received the assignment before his mind could process it. He struggled to find his breath after his lungs hit bottom. He clawed at the handkerchief around his neck, suffocating in the small apartment, its four walls pressing inward. Composure. He pressed his forehead against the cool edge of the wooden table, closing his eyes. The soft human touch of her hand on his neck grounded the present. The war had come squarely within his crosshairs. But the task, if done to specification, would lead to his destruction. She knew it too. Her bright eyes and lofty cheekbones sunk with the news. He rose again abruptly, shedding her hand to pace his anxieties. His boots thudded against the oak floorboards, punctuating his thoughts. He rambled an incoherent diatribe, raising his hands to the sides of his face. He doubted if he was the man for this. He turned away from her, shielding his inadequacy, and collapsed back into his chair. Ne pas choisir, c'est encore choisir. Warmth of her words curling around his ears. He looked up from his pool of self-pity. He nodded toward the candle, and she promptly blew it out. The rifle, his solitary weapon, lay hidden beneath a loose plank under her table. He knelt and pried it open, pulling the gun from its cocoon of oilcloth. The steel barrel was dull but unyielding, its weight steady in his hands. Their familiar movements through the weapon's actions formed a familiar and calming mantra. The click of its few moving parts is an unforgettable melody. Fantôme sat back on his heels, cradling the relic. His fingers traced the worn stock, fighting the flood of memories while oil and gunpowder curled around his nose. The relic had been with him through fields, across rivers, and into the heart of occupied Paris. The smell of oil and metal flooded his mind with memories. The weight of his thoughts knocked him back. He searched for the support of a wall as he inched backward, meeting it and sliding down it, cradling the rifle. He mourned what he must do. Her bare feet slid across the floor, finding him. She folded herself next to him, the warmth of her head perched on the crest of his shoulder. With one hand tucked around his arm, she stroked his thigh with the other. A soft hum of a familiar enchantment captured their presence until the symphony of morning birds took her place. He grabbed a painter's satchel, placed the rifle inside, and covered it with brushes and paint tubes. The makeshift disguise would not withstand scrutiny. He had the locket for that which she gently tucked into his breast pocket during an eternal kiss. Her delicate fingers looped the chain through the button as she had done many times before. Ne mourrez pas trop tôt ni trop tard. Her hand patted the pocket. Outside, sadness hardened to resolve in the crisp air, and action compelled action. The narrow alleys were bare, holding their breath anticipating. He followed familiar puddles of darkness quickly to the oak door. He carefully considered the velocity of his knock, a consideration for praying eyes outside and a delicate temperament inside. The Abramovichi door creaked open, and Ionel appeared, his frame outlined by the warm glow of the room behind him. His paint-streaked hands gripped the doorframe as though bracing for bad news. The sight of Fantôme's paint-smeared smock and satchel piqued his curiosity. "Fantôme," he said, His voice lowered and cautious, almost resigned. It's too early for a painting lesson. He tested the occasion with a joke. I need to use your attic, Phantom said, clipped and urgent. Tomorrow. Sacré-Cœur. Ionel's expression darkened. Tomorrow? Why here? I can see the steps from your attic, Phantom replied, his tone steady. And because I trust you. Ionel's laugh was sharp and bitter. Trust? Senelia stopped mixing trust long ago, my friend. He was referring to the supplier of Cézanne's palette. The words hung heavy between them. Phantom stepped closer, lowering his voice. Inaction is a choice. He borrowed her words. Ionel and Phantom both knew and could not hide it from each other. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair catching the dim light. She wrapped her shawl tighter, blocking the draught. Her eyes narrowed. What's going on? He wants to use the attic, Ionel said, gesturing toward Phantom. To watch. Or worse. To act, Phantom corrected. To act if necessary. He will be there. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. Behind her, Miriam emerged from the shadows, clutching a notebook to her chest. He? Miriam whispered, her voice trembling. Ionel turned to his wife. What do we do? If they find him here? They won't, Phantom interjected. I'll come up now, well before, and retreat in the confusion without notice. You have my word. Sophia's gaze lingered on Phantom, searching his face for something, truth perhaps, or reassurance. She shook her head wildly with a prophetic no. Ionel had not pleased her for 23 years by disregarding her wishes often, but Phantom was correct. Inaction is a choice. Although spilling from the lips of Phantom, this phrase was deeply hypocritical. His shoulders slumped as his body resigned. If you bring this upon us, we won't survive it. You will, Phantom said. I swear it. His eyes flashed to the left. With that, Phantom pushed past Ionel and up the narrow staircase. The war flowed into the humble maison. Scanning the rough plaster ceiling, he saw that the attic entrance was outlined in maple framing. Searching his hands along the ceiling, his fingers found a crack. Sliding a dilapidated desk under the newfound hole, he quickly mounted it and thrust himself into the tiny attic. Ionel followed tightly behind and slid the desk back to the wall, placing the lid on the attic just as precisely as it had been jarred loose. He unfurled his handkerchief to wipe the plaster remnants of the unexpected disturbance. A putrid bath of trapped dust and mildew, he got to work silently prying a solitary pane from the steeple window. The stench from the dank jar he used to relieve himself permeated his nose every time he opened it. He sketched his target area, setting his range and sights. When finished, he laid the rifle beside, hidden beneath a pile of rags. A slight chance of high-ground occupation gave Phantom pause about sleeping. Work done and lacking the effort to hold the weight of his eyes, he tilted his head onto his coat, clutching the locket and rubbing his thumb over the unmistakable grooves. After 1,000 breaths of consciousness punctuated by unbearably short fits of black, Phantom awoke for the final time. The horizon he was not accustomed to seeing from his perch was painted muted gold. Sacré-Cœur stood majestic against the sky, its alabaster facade offsetting the brown-shirted men who now filled its steps. The sea of stone was nearly invisible under the greased hair, brown coats and red armbands of tyranny. But the chaos of the gathering quickly snapped to order. Deer at the water, spotting a wolf. The doors to the 3 identical Mercedes Kubel wagons flew open, spilling dozens of gloved officers into the crowd under a sea of raised arms. Even in chaotic movements, their movements were rehearsed and efficient. Then he saw him. Phantom's target emerged last, his slightly taller frame and distinctive moustache unmistakable. As he moved, the crowd parted, crushing itself with deference. Leather-gloved hands outstretched on the railing. His conquest below, he surveyed the city with an air of quiet ownership. Paris is beautiful, but Berlin must be made better. These could have been his last words, Phantom thought, reading his lips. Eyes forward, Phantom's left hand found the cold muzzle of his rifle, freeing it from the cloth. He slid it forward toward the solitary hole in the window pane. Steady breath. Bone on bone. Rise, fall, hold. He practiced the comfortable dance of steady hands. 6 million souls rested on the rise and fall of the small spike, unslacking the trigger. Rise, fall, hold. The movement caused him to reset. Brown shirts and trench coats flanked their special guest for a photo of their conquest. A dainty man disappeared under a blanket, his right hand holding the bulb. Rise, fall, hold. Flash stained Phantom's retina, blinking furiously to try to clear his vision from the photographer's bulb and regain his focus while his subject's head ducked into his getaway. The motorcade quickly retreated down the cobbled streets and back to Berlin to never return. The round-up. Ouvrez la porte, maintenant. The Vichy officer's voice was harsh, impatient. Ionel opened the door cautiously, his face pale but composed. Behind him, Sophia clutched David, her arms wrapped protectively around his trembling body. Miriam stood to the side, her back straight, her notebook clutched to her chest like a shield. The officer at the door sneered. He was young, with a cruel smirk and eyes that gleamed with the sadistic pleasure of power. He looked Ionel up and down, then leaned in close, his voice dripping with mockery. Alors c'est toi le juif. Do you know what we do to men like you? His words were half French, half German, each syllable twisted with disdain. We've done nothing wrong, Ionel replied, his voice steady. We are only trying to live. The officer's smirk widened. Live? Is that what you call this? He gestured to the modest flat, his tone dripping with derision. A rat's nest, fitting for a family of vermin. Sophia tightened her grip on David, who whimpered softly. The officer's eyes flicked to her, and his smirk turned into something uglier. Your wife is a pretty one, isn't she? He said, his voice low and suggestive. Too pretty for the likes of you. He stepped forward, his gaze lingering on Sophia in a way that made her flinch. Perhaps we should take her first. A reward for our efforts, yes? Ionel stepped in front of his wife, his hands clenched into fists. You will not touch her. The officer laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed in the small space. Brave words, Juif, but bravery won't save you. He turned to the German officer behind him, who nodded once, his expression cold and indifferent. Papers! The Vichy officer barked, holding out his hand. Ionel reached for the bundle on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He handed the papers over, his fingers trembling only slightly. The officer snatched them away, glancing at them briefly before tossing them to the floor. It doesn't matter, he said with a shrug. You're coming with us, all of you, for questioning. No! Miriam's voice rang out, sharp and defiant. She stepped forward, her notebook still clutched tightly in her hands. We haven't done anything. You can't just... The officer moved faster than Ionel thought possible, backhanding Miriam across the face with a force that sent her sprawling to the floor. Phantom could hear the knock, shouting, and slaps from the attic. Sophia cried out, rushing to her daughter's side, but the officer grabbed her arm and yanked her back. You'll keep quiet, girl, he hissed, or I'll teach you what happens to insolent little rats. Ionel lunged toward the officer, but 2 more Vichy policemen stepped forward, pinning him against the wall. One of them slammed his fist into Ionel's stomach, doubling him over with a grunt of pain. Papa! David screamed, tears streaming down his face. The German officer slid forward. This is no way to treat a house guest. Will you at least do me the pleasure of inviting me to your table? Lacking an invitation, the 2 Vichy police officers wrestled Ionel to the small oak table, each twisting the arm they now held behind his back. Given my limited engagement with this area, I don't presume you are acquainted with me and my colleagues yet. He waved the Vichy off with a gloved hand. Enchanté, Ionel. My name is General Feldmarschall von Stulpnagel. The Führer has seen fit to appoint moi as the military governor of Paris. Punctuating his words, isolating the fingers of each gauntlet. Perhaps my absence from your quaint arrondissement and your lack of familiarity with my process is the reason for your family's hostility. Do you know what brings me to your humble home, Ionel? No. I'm sure you've now heard through the grapevine that our Führer paid your hilltop a visit earlier today, he said, scanning the thick oil paintings that covered the wall. You're probably wondering what that has to do with you, and the thought is natural for one to have. But unfortunately, my Vichy friends have alerted me to some unusual movement yesterday morning that must be resolved before my departure. Ionel's slack face was now trembling. How many are you? 4. Perhaps a better question is, how many were you before your visitor yesterday? Von Stupnagel stood, grasping his gloves in one hand. The Vichy pulled Ionel up to his feet. Stupnagel, now massaging the staircase as he ascended, Ionel in the trail. The unmistakable creaking of jackboots on stairs prompted Phantom to slowly lift his rifle, raising his upper body to a seated position. He crossed his legs, resting his elbows instinctively on his knees. He settled his bones into a stable frame, pointing his muzzle at the attic opening. Stupnagel reached the landing, motioning for the Vichy to push Ionel further into the room. The one lesson I've learned while looking after this chaotic city is that there is an order in the chaos. The French and you Jewish rats at least have one commonality. You are a docile breed. Your essence always precedes your existence. So when I hear that you were the benefactor of a rare early morning visitor, I wonder what purpose such a visit could serve for a Jew such as yourself. Phantom heard the scrape of the Luger as it left its canvas casing. So tell me, what was the nature of this visit? General Marshal von Stupnagel, I am sure you have it on good information that a visitor arrived, and I do not quarrel with the intelligence of your staff or my French brethren. Brothers? I'm sorry, General Field Marshal, but I mean to say that I have not had a visitor in as long as I can recall. I can speak for my family when I say that no one has been here. As he finished, Ionel's eyes lowered on a forgotten streak of plaster on the dilapidated desk betraying his words. Von Stupnagel followed his gaze to a narrow white streak of plaster dust. He followed it to the ceiling's rough surface and the wood-framed attic door. His index finger was raised to his mouth, signalling the Vichy to be silent and to inspect the source of the newfound plaster dust. Both men gripped the edge of the desk in unison, placing it below the hole. Phantom took the slack out of his rifle trigger. He had 7, but he would only need 3 at best. The problem is what lies beyond the bullet. The youngest Vichy, a fair-skinned man of perhaps 23, leapt on top of the desk, gloved hands stretched out, searching for the opening. Finding it, he lifted the lid, sliding it to the side as the warm, acrid air drifted downwards. A flashlight in one hand and a Luger in the other, he crested the lip, peering into the shadows of the attic. The light caught a boot partially concealed under burlap, and the Vichy traced it up the leg and torso of Phantom before his eyes settled and fixed on the muzzle of a rifle mere feet from his face. The beam of light rested on Phantom's eyes. The undisciplined Vichy had no time to wield the Luger around to act. Even so, Phantom was presented with a juicy target. Phantom shook his head slowly, telling the Vichy not to act. "Well, do we have a rat?" Stupnagel barked. "No, General Field Marshal," the Vichy twisted around, pretending to search every crevice of the tiny attic. "By the smell of it, not even a Jew could occupy this attic for long." "You'd be surprised," von Stupnagel quipped. "Genug, take the man. Leave the rest." The Vichy officer frowned but nodded, motioning for his men to haul Ionel to his feet. "Looks like you get a reprieve," he said to Sophia, his voice mocking. "For now." Ionel looked back at his family, his face a mask of pain and desperation. "Stay strong," he said, his voice breaking. "No matter what happens, stay strong." The officers dragged him out the door, his shoes scraping against the floor as he struggled against their grip. Sophia collapsed to her knees, clutching David and Miriam as the sound of boots faded into the distance. Phantom watched from his window, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He wanted to move, to act, but his body refused to obey. Through whispered channels, Phantom learned that Ionel had been taken to Drancy. The camp, just outside Paris, was a purgatory for Jews, a holding ground before the long journey east to the factories of death. Fantôme imagined Ionel there, standing in a sea of humanity stripped of dignity, clutching his sketchbook as if it were a lifeline. Weeks later, the whispers turned darker. Trains had left Drancy, their destinations unspoken but understood. Auschwitz. Fantôme knew the name, even if its horrors had not yet reached their complete infamy. He envisioned Ionel in the cold, his hands, those hands that had painted the streets of Montmartre with life and colour, reduced to tools of labour, or worse, silenced forever. Sophia and the children were left behind in the flat, their lives unravelling piece by piece. Without Ionel, the weight of survival fell entirely on Sophia's narrow shoulders. The once vibrant home grew quiet. Its silence was punctuated only by the muffled sounds of Miriam's crying or David's soft, confused questions. Fantôme watched from his own flat, unable to turn away. Sophia ventured out less frequently. When she did, she returned with little to show. Bread lines stretched for blocks, and the yellow star on her coat made her a target for glares and whispered slurs. Miriam stopped writing in her notebook, her once fierce spirit dulled by despair. Fantôme caught glimpses of her at the window, her green eyes staring blankly at the street below. David no longer played in the alley. Instead, he clung to his mother, his small frame shadowed by the growing darkness around them. Fantôme tried to justify his inaction. The resistance needed him alive, and he could not risk exposure. But these justifications tasted bitter, and his guilt grew heavier each day. The knock came again, this time heavier, more deliberate. Fantôme watched from across the street as Sophia opened the door. 2 officers stood there, one Vichy, the other German. They spoke briefly, their words too quiet for Fantôme to hear. The officer handed Sophia a small green card. Sophia nodded, her face pale but composed, and closed the door. That evening, as the city settled into its uneasy quiet, Fantôme heard a sound cut through the stillness, a muffled thud, followed by another. He rushed to the window, his chest tightening as he looked toward the courtyard. They lay twisted and broken, crumpled on the cobblestones. Fantôme staggered back from the window, bile rising in his throat. He could see their outlines, their bodies broken but together. Sophia's hair, now streaked with grey, lay splayed like a halo around her head. Miriam's notebook lay nearby, its pages fluttering in the night breeze. David's small hand was still clasped in his mother's. The rifle in the attic haunted him,